Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, and 93% of every book, every song, every movie, every piece of art humanity has ever created has vanished without a trace. Gone. Forever. The complete works of Shakespeare reduced to scattered fragments. Einstein's theories surviving only as half-remembered quotes. The Beatles' entire catalogue shrunk down to just one incomplete song. Sounds impossible, right? Like some dystopian nightmare that could never happen in our digital age. But here's the terrifying truth: it already did happen. And it wasn't some cosmic disaster or alien invasion that erased nearly a millennium of human knowledge. It was us. We did it to ourselves. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of history's greatest tragedies, a loss so devastating that scholars still weep when they talk about it. This is the story of the Great Library of Alexandria, the ancient world's ultimate treasure trove of human knowledge, and how its destruction robbed us of secrets we'll never recover. But before we explore what was lost, we need to understand what was found. Because what happened in this ancient Egyptian city wasn't just the building of a library, it was humanity's first attempt to capture lightning in a bottle, to gather every spark of human genius into one magnificent collection. And for 600 years, it actually worked. So settle in, because this isn't just a story about dusty scrolls and crumbling buildings. This is about the moment when humanity reached for the stars and the tragic forces that pulled us back down to Earth. The year was 334 BCE. Alexander the Great, barely 22 years old, was carving through the ancient world like a wildfire, leaving behind not just conquered territories, but a radical new vision of what civilization could become. As his armies swept across Egypt, he founded a city that would bear his name, Alexandria, and unknowingly planted the seed for what would become the greatest intellectual achievement in human history. But here's what most people don't realize. Alexander himself never saw his library. That honor belonged to his successors, the Ptolemaic dynasty, who understood something profound about power. While other rulers built their legacies on gold and armies, the Ptolemies built theirs on something far more valuable: knowledge itself. Picture ancient Alexandria not as some dusty academic outpost, but as the Silicon Valley of the ancient world. The smartest minds from across the known world flocked here, drawn by an unprecedented offer: complete financial freedom in exchange for pure intellectual pursuit. The Ptolemies didn't just fund scholars, they created the world's first think tank, where over 100 of history's brightest minds lived, worked, and thought together under one roof. The institution they created wasn't just called a library, it was called the Mouseion, the place of the Muses, after the 9 Greek goddesses of the arts and sciences. And walking through its halls was like stepping into the future. Imagine corridors lined with scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of civilizations stretching from India to Spain. Picture lecture halls where the greatest minds of the age debated questions that still puzzle us today. Envision gardens where philosophers strolled while contemplating the mysteries of the universe. But what made this place truly revolutionary wasn't just what they collected, it was how they collected it. The Ptolemies were obsessed, and I mean absolutely obsessed, with acquiring every piece of written knowledge that existed. They turned book collecting into an art form, and they weren't above using some pretty creative methods to build their collection. Here's where the story gets wild. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbor was subject to what we might call the world's first copyright raid. Ptolemaic officials would board incoming vessels and search for any books, scrolls, or written materials. Found something interesting? Too bad it was immediately confiscated, taken to the library, and copied by professional scribes. Sometimes they'd return the original and keep the copy. Sometimes they'd keep the original and return the copy. And sometimes, well, let's just say, not every ship captain left Alexandria with the same books they arrived with. The books acquired through this maritime piracy were even given a special designation. They were labeled from the ships, creating what might be history's first catalogue of stolen intellectual property. But the Ptolemies didn't stop there. They were willing to go to extraordinary lengths for truly valuable texts. One story perfectly captures their obsession. Ptolemy III wanted to get his hands on the original manuscripts of the great Greek tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These weren't just any copies. These were the original, authentic texts preserved in the Athenian state archives and considered so precious that they were never loaned out to anyone, under any circumstances. But Ptolemy was nothing if not resourceful. He convinced the Athenian authorities to lend him these priceless manuscripts, offering a deposit equivalent to about $4 million in today's money as security. The Athenians, figuring no one would be crazy enough to forfeit that kind of cash for some old scrolls, agreed to the loan. Guess what happened next? Ptolemy kept the originals, forfeited his massive deposit, and sent back beautiful copies made on the finest papyrus money could buy. The Athenians were probably too stunned to be angry. After all, who spends $4 million on library books? This wasn't just collecting. This was a systematic campaign to gather every scrap of human knowledge under one roof. The Ptolemies sent agents across the known world, buying, borrowing, and yes, sometimes stealing manuscripts from every civilization they could reach. They collected works in Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Indian, Assyrian, and dozens of other languages, creating what was essentially the world's first universal library. And the numbers? They're staggering. Conservative estimates suggest the library held around 400,000 scrolls at its peak. More optimistic calculations put the number closer to 700,000. But here's what makes those numbers truly mind-blowing. Each scroll could contain multiple works. A single scroll might hold several poems, plays, or treatises. So we're not just talking about hundreds of thousands of individual documents. We're talking about potentially millions of individual works. To put this in perspective, imagine trying to recreate this collection today. You'd need to gather not just every book in the Library of Congress, but every book in every major library in the world. You'd need manuscripts from cultures that no longer exist, written in languages that have been dead for millennia, covering topics that we've completely forgotten how to think about. But the true genius of Alexandria wasn't just in collecting all this knowledge, it was in what they did with it. This wasn't some dusty archive where scrolls went to die. This was a living, breathing center of research and discovery, where the collected wisdom of humanity was actively studied, debated, and expanded upon. The scholars who lived and worked at the Mouseion weren't just librarians or copying clerks. They were the cream of the ancient intellectual crop, each one a specialist in their field, each one contributing to humanity's understanding of the world. They lived in a kind of scholarly paradise, free housing, free food, tax exemption, and a generous salary, all in exchange for one simple requirement: think, discover, and teach. And think they did. The work that came out of Alexandria during its golden age reads like a greatest hits collection of human intellectual achievement. These weren't just academics working in isolation. They were part of a collaborative network that would make modern research universities jealous. Take Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as the library's head librarian for decades. This guy wasn't just running a library, he was revolutionizing our understanding of the world itself. Using the extensive geographical data available in the library's collection, he became the first person to calculate the Earth's circumference. And get this, his calculation was accurate to within less than 1% of the actual measurement. Think about that for a moment. More than 2,000 years ago, using nothing but scrolls, basic geometry, and brilliant reasoning, a librarian in Alexandria figured out how big our planet was, with stunning precision. He didn't have satellites or GPS or computers. He had books, and he had a mind that knew how to use them. But Eratosthenes was just one star in a constellation of brilliance. The library attracted polymaths turned multiple fields of knowledge scholars who mass in a way that seems almost impossible by today's standards of specialization. These were people who could write poetry in the morning, solve mathematical problems in the afternoon, and conduct astronomical observations at night. The medical advances alone that came out of Alexandria were revolutionary. Doctors like Herophilus and Erasistratus conducted some of the first systematic studies of human anatomy, making discoveries about the circulatory and nervous systems that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance more than 1,000 years later. The mathematicians working in Alexandria's halls were pushing the boundaries of human understanding in ways that still make modern scholars shake their heads in amazement. Apollonius of Perga was developing theories about conic sections, the mathematical relationships that govern everything from planetary orbits to the trajectory of a thrown ball, concepts so advanced that they became foundational to physics and engineering millennia later. But perhaps the most tragic figure in this entire story is someone you might not expect, a woman named Hypatia. By the late 4th century, she had become the most renowned mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher in the known world. Think about that for a second. In an era when women were barely considered capable of learning to read, Hypatia was literally the smartest person on the planet. She was the daughter of Theon, the library's final head librarian, and she carried on his desperate mission to preserve Greek mathematical and astronomical knowledge during increasingly dangerous times. Hypatia wasn't just teaching and researching. She was fighting a race against time to save centuries of human achievement from the forces that were already beginning to tear Alexandria apart. Her public lectures drew crowds from across the Mediterranean. Students traveled hundreds of miles just to hear her explain the mysteries of mathematics and the movements of the stars. She wrote commentaries on the great mathematical works of antiquity, adding her own insights and discoveries. In many ways, she represented everything the Library of Alexandria had become: brilliant, innovative, and tragically vulnerable. Because while scholars like Hypatia were pushing human knowledge to new heights, dark forces were gathering. The world around Alexandria was changing, and not in ways that favored learning and intellectual curiosity. Religious fanaticism was rising, political tensions were escalating, and the very idea that knowledge itself was valuable regardless of where it came from or what it taught was coming under attack. The diversity of knowledge housed within Alexandria's walls would seem impossible by today's standards. Imagine walking through corridors where Egyptian priests were translating ancient hieroglyphic texts, while Greek philosophers debated Aristotelian logic, where Indian mathematicians were sharing numerical systems that would revolutionize calculation, where Persian astronomers were comparing their star charts with Babylonian observations that stretched back centuries. This wasn't just multiculturalism, this was intellectual fusion on a scale humanity had never attempted before and arguably hasn't achieved since. Different civilizations, different ways of thinking, different approaches to understanding the world, all brought together in one place where they could cross-pollinate and create entirely new forms of knowledge. The library's geography section alone would have been worth more than entire modern universities. They had detailed maps of trade routes that connected India to Britain, navigational charts that showed sea currents and wind patterns, ethnographic studies of peoples from the frozen north to the scorching deserts of Africa. When ancient merchants planned expeditions to distant lands, they consulted Alexandria's geographical archives. When generals planned military campaigns, they studied Alexandria's maps. And the literature section? It's almost painful to think about what was lost there. The library held the complete works of hundreds of authors, whose names we know only from references in other texts. Imagine having access to the full body of work from every major poet, playwright, and storyteller from the ancient world. We're talking about literary treasures that would redefine our understanding of human creativity and expression. Consider this sobering example. The ancient Greek poet Sappho was considered one of the greatest lyrical geniuses who ever lived. Her contemporaries ranked her alongside Homer himself. The Library of Alexandria held all 9 volumes of her collected works, roughly 10,000 lines of poetry that captured the full range of human emotion with a beauty that left ancient readers breathless. Today, We have about 650 lines of her work. That's it. Less than 7% of one of history's greatest poetic voices survived the destruction of Alexandria. The other 93% gone forever. We'll never know what insights into love, loss, joy, and human nature vanished with those lost scrolls. We'll never hear the full voice of a woman who could move entire audiences to tears with her words. And Sappho was just one author among thousands. Multiply that loss across every field of human knowledge, and you begin to grasp the true magnitude of what Alexandria represented and what we lost when it fell. The scientific works housed in Alexandria would have accelerated human progress by centuries, maybe millennia. Ancient astronomers had calculated the movements of planets with remarkable precision. Mathematicians had developed theorems that wouldn't be discovered again until the Renaissance. Engineers had designed machines and architectural techniques that were forgotten and had to be painfully redeveloped over hundreds of years. But here's what makes the loss even more heartbreaking. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just preserving old knowledge, it was actively creating new knowledge. The scholars working there weren't just copying and cataloguing, they were experimenting, theorizing, and discovering. They were building on the foundation of accumulated human wisdom to push the boundaries of what was possible. This was humanity's greatest intellectual experiment, and for 600 years, it worked brilliantly. Alexandria became the beating heart of human civilization, pumping new ideas and discoveries out to the rest of the world. Trade routes carried not just goods but knowledge. Diplomatic missions brought not just political messages but scientific observations. The library's influence rippled across continents. But empires rise and fall, and even the greatest human achievements are vulnerable to forces beyond their control. By the 3rd century CE, cracks were already beginning to show. Political instability was weakening the Ptolemaic dynasty's ability to fund the library. Religious conflicts were creating tension between different scholarly traditions. Economic pressures were making it harder to maintain the vast infrastructure needed to support such an ambitious intellectual enterprise. And then came the events that would change everything. Not a single catastrophic moment, but a series of disasters spread across centuries, each one chipping away at Alexandria's greatness until finally, inevitably, the light went out. The first major blow came from an unexpected source, Julius Caesar himself. In 48 BCE, during his civil war with Pompey, Caesar found himself trapped in Alexandria's harbor, outnumbered and surrounded by enemy ships. His solution was characteristically bold and characteristically destructive. He ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian fleet. The flames spread beyond their intended target. Ancient sources describe scrolls burning in storehouses near the harbor, precious manuscripts turning to ash in the Mediterranean wind. Some historians claim 40,000 scrolls were lost in that single fire. Others argue the damage was minimal. But regardless of the exact numbers, something irreplaceable was destroyed that day, and it was just the beginning. The real tragedy wasn't Caesar's fire. It was what came next. Because as the Roman Empire grew more powerful, it also grew more paranoid. Knowledge became dangerous. Ideas became threats. And the very diversity that had made Alexandria great started to make it a target. By the 4th century CE, a new force was rising across the Roman world, Christianity. And while early Christians weren't necessarily anti-intellectual, they were absolutely anti-pagan. Every scroll in Alexandria that didn't align with Christian doctrine suddenly became suspect. Every philosophical text that explored ideas outside Christian teaching became heretical. Every scientific work that contradicted biblical accounts became blasphemous. The tension had been building for decades, but it exploded in 391 CE when Emperor Theodosius issued a decree that would seal Alexandria's fate. With the stroke of a pen, he authorized the destruction of pagan temples throughout the empire. Not their conversion, their complete destruction. In Alexandria, This meant the Serapeum, the temple complex that housed roughly 10% of the library's collection. Bishop Theophilus didn't just follow the emperor's orders, he embraced them with frightening enthusiasm. Christian mobs stormed the temple, smashing statues, toppling columns, and setting fire to everything that represented the old pagan world. And that included the scrolls. Thousands upon thousands of irreplaceable manuscripts, works of mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, literature, were dragged into the streets and burned. Not because they were wrong, but because they were pagan. Not because they were dangerous, but because they represented a way of thinking that no longer had a place in the new Christian world. Imagine being a scholar, watching from the sidelines as centuries of human achievement literally went up in smoke. Picture seeing the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Euclid tossed onto bonfires by people who couldn't even read them. Think about the sound those scrolls must have made as they crackled and burned, each pop and hiss representing another lost discovery, another silenced voice, another severed thread in the tapestry of human knowledge. But even this wasn't the end, because there was one final, heartbreaking chapter yet to be written in Alexandria's story. Her name was Hypatia, and she represented everything the library had once stood for: brilliant, curious, unafraid to ask difficult questions or challenge accepted wisdom. By 415 CE, Hypatia was the last great scholar of Alexandria, carrying on her father's desperate mission to preserve what remained of the ancient world's intellectual heritage. She taught mathematics and astronomy to students who traveled from across the Mediterranean to learn from her. She wrote commentaries on classical texts, trying to keep alive traditions that were rapidly disappearing. She gave public lectures that drew crowds eager to hear someone who still believed knowledge was worth pursuing for its own sake. But the world around her was changing in ways that made her very existence provocative. Here was a woman, in an increasingly patriarchal society, who dared to teach men. Here was a pagan philosopher in an increasingly Christian world who refused to convert. Here was someone who asked questions in a time when having the right answers was becoming more important than seeking truth. The end came swiftly and brutally. In March of 415 CE, during the season of Lent, a mob of Christian fanatics dragged Hypatia from her carriage as she traveled through Alexandria's streets. They hauled her into a church, a building that should have represented sanctuary, and there they stripped her naked and scraped her skin with sharp shells until she died. Then they dismembered her body and burned the pieces to ash. With Hypatia's murder, something died in Alexandria that would never be reborn. Her students fled the city, carrying with them whatever knowledge they could save. The tradition of open inquiry that had flourished for 7 centuries came to an abrupt and violent end. The light that had burned so brightly in Alexandria was finally extinguished. But here's the part that will make your blood run cold. We still don't know the full extent of what was lost, because unlike a modern library fire, where we have catalogues and records and backup copies stored elsewhere, the destruction of Alexandria left almost no trace of what had been there. We know what survived, but we can only guess at what didn't. Think about it this way. Every ancient text we have today, every play by Sophocles, every dialogue by Plato, every treatise by Aristotle, survived because copies existed somewhere other than Alexandria. But what about the works that existed only in Alexandria? What about the authors whose complete collected works were housed nowhere else? What about the discoveries and innovations that were recorded only in those scrolls that went up in flames? The mathematical loss alone is staggering. Ancient Greek mathematicians had developed concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance, and some that we're still trying to fully understand today. They had calculated astronomical phenomena with precision that rivals our modern instruments. They had developed engineering techniques that we're only now beginning to appreciate. But it's not just the technical knowledge that was lost, it's the human knowledge, the stories, the poetry, the philosophical insights, the personal accounts of what life was like in the ancient world. We lost voices, thousands and thousands of individual human voices that had something to say about love, death, hope, fear, justice, beauty, and what it means to be human. And here's perhaps the cruelest irony of all. Much of what was destroyed in Alexandria was actually recovered knowledge from even earlier civilizations. The library hadn't just preserved Greek and Roman learning, it had saved and translated works from Egypt, Babylon, Persia, India, and dozens of other cultures. When Alexandria burned, we didn't just lose Hellenistic knowledge, we lost humanity's memory of itself stretching back millennia. Consider the ripple effects. How many scientific breakthroughs were delayed by centuries because the foundational research was lost in Alexandria's flames? How many artistic traditions were broken because the master works that inspired them no longer existed? How many philosophical insights were lost because the chain of intellectual development was severed? Some historians argue that the fall of Alexandria directly contributed to the Dark Ages, that period of intellectual stagnation that gripped Europe for nearly 1,000 years. Without the preserved wisdom of the ancients, scholars had to start from scratch, slowly and painfully rebuilding knowledge that had already been discovered, refined, and perfected centuries earlier. But the tragedy extends beyond what was lost to how it was lost. This wasn't some natural disaster or unavoidable catastrophe. This was human choice. People decided that certain kinds of knowledge were dangerous. They decided that some questions shouldn't be asked. They decided that preserving the wisdom of the past was less important than enforcing the orthodoxy of the present. And that's what makes the story of Alexandria so relevant today. Because we're still making those choices. We're still deciding what knowledge is worth preserving and what can be discarded. We're still struggling with the tension between intellectual freedom and social stability, between open inquiry and accepted truth. The Library of Alexandria represented humanity at its best, curious, collaborative, committed to understanding the world through reason and evidence. Its destruction represents humanity at its worst, fearful, fanatical, willing to destroy what it doesn't understand. Today, we have the internet, cloud storage, digital archives that seem indestructible. We tell ourselves that nothing like Alexandria could ever happen again. But knowledge is still fragile. Civilizations still rise and fall. And the forces that destroyed Alexandria, religious extremism, political instability, anti-intellectual sentiment, haven't disappeared from the world. In fact, they're stronger than ever. Around the globe, libraries are being defunded, researchers are being silenced, and entire fields of study are being declared off-limits because they produce inconvenient truths. The methods have changed, but the underlying threat remains the same: the human tendency to fear knowledge that challenges power. Every time a government censors scientific research, every time religious authorities ban books, every time political movements attack universities, the ghost of Alexandria stirs. Because the same impulses that led Christian mobs to burn pagan scrolls are still with us, dressed in modern clothes but driven by ancient fears. The scholars of Alexandria believed something radical: that knowledge belongs to everyone, that truth is worth pursuing regardless of where it leads, and that human civilization advances when we build on the discoveries of those who came before us. They created something unprecedented: a truly universal library where all human knowledge could be gathered, studied, and preserved for future generations. We destroyed it, and in doing so, we robbed ourselves of secrets we'll never recover, insights we'll never reclaim, and voices we'll never hear again. The scrolls are gone, the scholars are dead, the library is dust. But the questions Alexandria raised about who controls knowledge and why still burn as brightly today as those flames that consumed the greatest collection of human wisdom the world has ever known. The question that haunts every historian who studies Alexandria isn't just what was lost, it's what we don't even know we lost. Because here's the terrifying reality. We can only mourn the knowledge we know existed. But what about the discoveries, the innovations, the brilliant insights that were so completely erased that we don't even have fragments to remember them by? Think about this for a moment. Every ancient text that survived to reach our modern world did so because copies existed in multiple locations. The works of Homer survived because scribes in Athens, Rome, and Constantinople all preserved copies. Aristotle's writings endured because scholars across the Mediterranean world valued them enough to copy and recopy them through the centuries. But what about the works that existed only in Alexandria? What about the brilliant mathematicians whose theorems were recorded nowhere else? What about the poets whose verses were copied only once, filed away in those endless corridors of scrolls? What about the historians who documented civilizations we've now completely forgotten existed? These ghost works haunt the imagination of every scholar who studies the ancient world. We know they existed because other authors reference them, quote from them, build upon their ideas, but the works themselves, gone without a trace. It's like trying to understand a conversation when you can only hear one side, except in this case we lost thousands of voices simultaneously. Consider the practical implications of this loss. Ancient engineers had solved problems that we're still wrestling with today. They had figured out how to build structures that could withstand earthquakes, how to create ventilation systems that could cool massive buildings without electricity, how to construct harbors that could accommodate the largest ships of their era. The Library of Alexandria contained detailed technical manuals, architectural blueprints, and engineering treatises that documented these solutions. When those scrolls burned, we didn't just lose abstract knowledge, we lost practical wisdom that could have prevented centuries of trial and error, countless engineering failures, and immeasurable human suffering. The same applies to medicine. Ancient physicians had developed treatments and surgical techniques based on centuries of accumulated experience. They had identified diseases, catalogued symptoms, and documented which remedies worked and which didn't. The Alexandria Library contained medical texts that represented the collective healing wisdom of dozens of civilizations. When Christian mobs burned those medical scrolls, they weren't just destroying pagan philosophy, they were destroying knowledge that could have saved lives. How many people died from diseases that ancient doctors already knew how to cure? How many surgical techniques had to be painfully rediscovered over hundreds of years? How much human suffering could have been prevented if that medical knowledge had survived? But perhaps the most heartbreaking loss wasn't scientific or technical, it was cultural. The Library of Alexandria contained the stories, myths, legends, and oral traditions of peoples from across the known world. These weren't just entertainment. They were the collective memory of human civilization, the ways different cultures made sense of existence, love, death, and meaning. When those stories burned, entire worldviews vanished forever. We lost ways of thinking about human nature that took millennia to develop. We lost perspectives on life, death, and meaning that could have enriched human understanding immeasurably. We lost the voices of countless storytellers whose insights into the human condition were deemed unworthy of preservation simply because they didn't align with Christian doctrine. The ripple effects of Alexandria's destruction extended far beyond the ancient world. When European scholars of the Renaissance began rediscovering classical knowledge, they were working with incomplete fragments. The great revival of learning that followed the Dark Ages was based on whatever scraps of ancient wisdom had survived the centuries of neglect and destruction. Imagine how different the Renaissance might have been if scholars had access to the complete Library of Alexandria. Instead of slowly piecing together fragmentary texts, they could have built upon the full flowering of ancient knowledge. Instead of spending centuries rediscovering basic principles, they could have started from where the ancients left off and pushed human understanding to heights we can barely imagine. The scientific revolution might have happened 1,000 years earlier. The artistic achievements of the Renaissance might have been even more spectacular. The philosophical insights of the Enlightenment might have developed along entirely different lines. We might be living in a world centuries more advanced than our current one, simply because the accumulated wisdom of antiquity had been preserved rather than destroyed. But the loss extends beyond even these grand historical what-ifs. Alexandria represented something more fundamental than just a collection of books. It represented a way of thinking about knowledge itself. The scholars who worked there believed that all human learning was connected, that insights from one field could illuminate discoveries in another, that the pursuit of truth was more important than the comfort of accepted beliefs. This interdisciplinary approach to knowledge was revolutionary for its time and would seem radical even today. Ancient Alexandria housed mathematicians who were also poets, astronomers who were also philosophers, physicians who were also historians. They understood that human knowledge is a unified whole, that artificial boundaries between disciplines often prevent us from seeing deeper truths. When Alexandria fell, this integrated approach to learning died with it. The medieval world that followed was characterized by rigid compartmentalization. Theologians studied theology, physicians studied medicine, and never the two should meet. This intellectual fragmentation persisted for centuries, and in many ways continues to plague academic institutions today. So the next time someone tells you that knowledge is indestructible, that human progress is inevitable, that we'll never lose what we've learned, remember Alexandria. Remember that our entire digital world could vanish just as completely as those ancient scrolls. Remember that every generation must choose between preserving wisdom and destroying what threatens them. Because somewhere in the ashes of that great library lie the answers to questions we don't even know how to ask yet. The story of Alexandria isn't just ancient history, it's a warning written in flames and blood, echoing across 25 centuries to remind us that civilization is far more fragile than we dare to believe. Every time we take our knowledge for granted, every time we assume that human progress moves only forward, every time we forget that books can burn and scholars can be silenced, we ignore the lesson that Alexandria died to teach us. Tonight, as you sleep surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of millennia accessible through devices that would seem like magic to Hypatia, preserved in digital archives that dwarf even Alexandria's legendary collection, remember this: we are the guardians now. We are the ones who must choose between curiosity and comfort, between protecting dangerous knowledge and destroying uncomfortable truths. The scrolls of Alexandria are gone forever, but the questions they contained burn as brightly as ever. Who decides what knowledge is worth preserving? What truths are too dangerous to speak? And when the mobs come for our libraries, whether they carry torches or legislation, will we have the courage to stand in their way? Because somewhere in the darkness between what we know and what we've lost, the ghost of the Great Library of Alexandria is still burning. And it will keep burning until we prove we've learned from humanity's greatest intellectual tragedy. The question isn't whether we can rebuild what was destroyed, it's whether we're wise enough to protect what remains.